To discuss, we're hoping to be joined by the ILO Director in South Africa. In the meantime, we are joined by Siyabonga Hadebe, who's the Labour Attache at the South African Permanent Mission to the UN. And we're also joined by the CEO of Business Unity South Africa, Cas Coovadia. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I understand that you're in the same room, so if you're not talking, please mute for the sake of feedback. And let me start with you, Mr. Hadebe. Do you know some of the sad examples? We hear that almost half of these kids are in work that is seen as pretty treacherous to their well-being. Just tell us the extent of the problem.
Good afternoon, madam. We are struggling with the audio. There's a lot of feedback from your end, so it's not easy to hear what you were asking me.
Mr. Hadebe, let me try again, and let me again ask you both to mute if you're not talking. I think that may help, and we're trying to work on the technical glitches on our side. I was asking if you know examples of kids in child labour, what they're doing. Let's try put a human element to this tragedy first.
Yeah, I'm really struggling. I'm also struggling. We are struggling.
All right, I think let's cut this call and let's see if we can fix the little gremlins that we're facing. All right, we have, let's see if this is different, because he's in a different situation. Dr Joni Musabayana, who is the ILO Director in South Africa. Doctor, are you able to hear me clearly? Doctor, can you unmute?
Thank you.
All right, Doctor, if you can hear me, I'm glad that you've joined us, and I wanted to put a human face to the tragedy. I mean, can you tell us examples of children in child labour around the world, what they're doing? What are some of the saddest examples that you've come across?
I think what is key is that of the 160 million children in child labor, about 70% are in agriculture, which means that the phenomenon of child labor is largely raw-based in the first place. And 60% of the 160 million are actually on the African continent. And therefore we can say the face of a child laborer is in agriculture and largely in Africa.
And of the 160 million, nearly 80 million are in hazardous work. What does that mean?
Yes, hazardous forms of work, if that's what you're... The driver of hazardousness, if I could use that word, is the chemicals that these children have to use. Some of the equipment that they also have to use. But the biggest danger to children in agriculture largely relies with the chemicals, particularly pesticides, which are hazardous to the health of the young people.
Tell us what you're seeing in Africa. So this is important for the continent, you said, and it is, this conference is being held for the first time on African soil. What are the regional differences? I understand, and it's no surprise, that it's better in regions where primary school education, for example, is prioritized.
That is very true. When you disaggregate the African number, you know that Africa is divided into three major regions, north, west, south, central, east and southern. The major predominance of child labor is in the central belt, particularly the Central Africa and East Africa. And that says that West, North and Southern Africa carry much less of the number. And those that are in the central belt of Africa, there are two factors. When you look to more East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, this part of the world, that is largely rural-based agriculture. But when you go to further to Central Africa Republic, DRC, Congo Brazzaville, there you see that the phenomenon of conflict plays a key role. So there is also not just the children in agriculture, but children affected by conflict. And unfortunately, the Central Africa belt turns out to be the one that is largely afflicted by conflict. And that has a spill-on effect on the children who end up, unfortunately, some even becoming child soldiers.
Sure. All right, let's try bring in one of our other guests. We were having some technical problems earlier. Cas Coovadia, head of Business Unity South Africa. This isn't a major issue in South Africa, but do you believe it's significant? It's being held here, given that this is a largely African problem.
Alison, I'm sorry, I just can't hear very well. Yeah, I think you said this is a major issue, including in South Africa. It certainly is, and I think in the panel discussion and in the plenary earlier today, the point was made that it's got to be in businesses' interest to ensure that children are not at work, they are not exploited through child labor, and that they should be in school, they should be educated, and that's got to be good for the economy. And so it's very much in businesses' interest to work with other stakeholders to minimize child labor. The point was also made, and we would tend to agree with that the core reason for this is that families depend, unfortunately, on children working. The point was made that 7 out of 10 children work either with or for families, and that's because families need as many people as possible in families to work. And so we've got to work together as governments, business, NGOs, and other social partners to ensure that we have the appropriate social protection nets, to ensure that we actually structure our economy such that people have jobs, adults have jobs, and children actually go to school and get educated. And so we've got to pull together on this and by 2025 meet the targets that we set for ourselves.
All right, let me see if I can bring in Mr. Hadebe. I hope you're not having the same issue. You can also outline the situation in South Africa, and we often talk about decent work, and I guess the issue with child labor is it deprives kids of their childhood. Give us some of the long-term effects as well.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you. Now I can hear you very well. The question is quite fundamental in the sense that it talks about the problems that we have in general, because child labor is not an independent factor. It is linked to other variables. If you are in a country that has inequality, that has got high levels of poverty, a country that suffers from high unemployment as well as low economic growth, then you are definitely going to have these problems, because families are not earning enough. And in as much as we have done so well as a country to try and make people to access social protection, child grants, old age pension, and on the side of the labor market, we have also come up with the national minimum wage and so on. We are not doing so well, and unfortunately, the long-term effects of this are that the children are going to be thrown into the streets, trying to look for livelihoods, but also some of the rogue elements amongst us are going to take advantage of these children, and the children are drawn into situations like sexual industry and other industries that are quite violent in their makeup. Yes, the long-term nature is that we are likely to lose a generation if we are not careful.
Yeah, we've actually been reporting on young women, 15-year-olds, selling their bodies for sex. That's voluntary but illegal in this country. That's one of the stories this week. I guess with young girls, often exploitation is part of it. And that's to you again, Mr. Hadebe.
Yes, ma'am. It is quite an unfortunate situation to see young girls standing in street corners trying to earn a living. But of course, the issues of poverty, as I've already said, they are quite rife. And in other instances, you find that these are children that do not even have parents because of the problem of, let's say, HIV/AIDS, or parents have perished for one other reason. Then the children would find themselves in the streets, and I don't believe that it is an image that the country would like to portray, where we've got young kids standing in street corners trying to earn a living through sex work. And also they get subjected to all sorts of other problems like drugs and bodily harms. It's quite hard there because they are owned by pimps and people who traffic them all over the world. We've had cases of young women from South Africa being caught as mules in other parts of the world. And you go to prisons in places like Brazil, they are full of young women from South Africa. This is not something that we would like to be proud about.
Dr. Musabayana, what about safety nets? What about social grants? South Africa has been lauded for a wide-ranging social grants program. It's probably not enough, but I think 480 is the child support grant. Does that make a real difference? And obviously we're not seeing that in many African countries. Please unmute, Doctor.
I got paid every time you say unmute. One has to say that the South African government has come quite far in trying to extend social protection coverage to the majority of her population. I think statistics have come out that roughly 1 in 2 people are accessing some form of social protection. And the issue of child support grant is a key one at 400 something rand per month. And complement that with the feeding schemes at the schools. That is also a particular measure to ensure that particularly the no-fee schools where people are not paying fees, which is also another key policy instrument. The combination of all the social protection measures, particularly the feeding schemes, because as Cas has said, families end up scrambling for food because the incomes are low, and the majority of the child laborers are in fact working with family members, which means they're trying to complement the family income and putting food on the table for their family. And so when they go to school and they're able to have a decent meal at school, one, it encourages higher levels of attendance of schools, and that is key. And I think a study by Stats SA showed that in 2019, 98% of children in South Africa between 7 and 17 years attended school. And that is something to really be happy about. But that same study also found that roughly about 2.3 million young people were involved in commercial work, in economic work, some of which, as my colleague Siyabonga has highlighted, is in the worst forms, particularly sexual exploitation and trafficking. So the methods that the government has put in place, particularly extending social protection, are to be lauded. And one has to say the 2 million is a residual effect from the positive impact of the social protection package and windows that are provided. If these were not in place, one would shudder to think that this number would easily be 4 million, 6 million. When you consider that the percentage of people who are not working, according to the labor force survey, if I'm not mistaken, is now perhaps around 10, 12 million people. And one can therefore imagine that the child labor element would also be equally that much higher, were it not for the social protection measures, particularly by the Department of Social Development in partnership with the Department of Basic Education. So yes, those are good practices the South African government are putting into place and are trying to make to minimize the impact of what would be a worse off situation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is touching us much more, in fact, than I expected. Cas Coovadia, I hope you can hear me. This is one of the Sustainable Development Goals that seems to be getting out of reach. 2025, just years away. What role can business play? I mean, South Africa accused of looking inward, and we know that COVID-19 has made things worse, given our unemployment, but it sounds like African countries have to come together, and different stakeholders have to come together somehow to combat this.
No, absolutely. Because if we look inwards, and particularly as South Africa, we have people coming here as migrants, looking for opportunities here, and it's not in our interest to have an inward approach towards this. We've got to work as a continent. I think that you know, one of the speakers on the panel just now made the point that our governments also need to play a critical role in this and not just pay lip service to it. Governments have got to actually take the lead in this. We absolutely applaud South African government for the social protection measures we have, but we can't have more than half the population of the country on social protection and consider that to be sustainable. In South Africa, as in other parts of the continent, we've got to look for sustainable solutions, which means creating jobs for adults who can be at work, which means building our economies, which means managing our governance properly so that we minimize, if not eradicate, corruption and so on, and we have capable governments that are actually able to do what they have been elected to do. And then business needs to come to the party to ensure that we hold our own to account, where children are being exploited for labor. One understands that families need their children to work, but then we've got to provide the necessary social protection as government. We've got to ensure as business that we call out businesses that are using child labor. And we've got to move as a country and as a continent toward the 2025 targets. So, you know, it's going to be very difficult to meet them, but I think that conferences like these highlight the issue. But after these sorts of conferences, we've got to be able to show that we are coming together as a continent and the different stakeholders of the continent to actually make an impact on this. No, government alone can't do it, business alone can't do it, and NGOs alone can't do it. And it's a multifaceted problem. We've got to address the core of the problem, which is to actually have growing economies that create jobs so that adults can work and start businesses and be enterprising and employ people, and children can be at school and university and grow and develop the skills that we need in this continent.
Mr. Hadebe, maybe you can pick up there and I'll give you the last word. I understand this conference is being seen as a call to action, as the previous ones were, but how do you make the countries and the organizations and the communities that are still accepting of child labor actually listen?
Thank you for that question, because this is the main concern, because everybody is asking us. Of course, we are trying to nudge the countries and social partners to act in order to eliminate child labor. But the issue here that we have is that not everyone is even aware that child labor exists, or what they are doing is child labor. And even where there is prevalence of a number of cases, the level of reporting is not there. So the lack of knowledge is probably one of the challenges that we have. So what will be important now is that we would like to make these programs known, and so that people become aware that we cannot be subjecting children into situations of this kind. And but unfortunately, in other instances, situations of war, instability, social instability, and so on, make it hard for even communities to be orderly themselves. That's where the leakages occur. But as my colleague Cas mentioned, the bigger problem also concerns the interlinkages between countries. Some of the linkages are legal, some are not legal. For example, we are having a lot of people who are streaming into different countries, and South Africa is one of those countries that accepts quite a lot of people. And the majority of those people, because they are in a vulnerable state, they are easily exploited, and in most cases the children are also part of the contingent that comes into South Africa, and you see this phenomenon across the world. So the issue here is that we are dealing also with people who are invisible citizens, so to speak. So it means that countries need to fix the entire policy framework, not just focusing on child labor, but across board, in order to deal with the problem. So we've got a lot of work in our hands, and for as long as we are not doing what we are supposed to be doing, this problem will persist.
Yeah, formidable task has to be achieved in just 3 years. 160 million children, according to the ILO, in child labour. All right, thank you very much for that panel discussion. That was Dr Joni Musabayana, ILO Director in South Africa, Siyabonga Hadebe, the Labour Attache at the South African Permanent Mission to the UN, and Cas Coovadia, CEO of Business Unity South Africa.